Hey everybody, Professor Rossi here with what I thought was just a quick overview of what I think we can expect from the Trump-Putin meeting tomorrow in Anchorage, Alaska. I've been going through YouTube over the past couple of hours through various channels that I have either been guests on or have followed. And I have what, I feel is my own assessment of what we can realistically expect because, if nothing else, the media that has been following this intended meeting is coming up with their own narratives of what might happen. American Western media want you to believe that Russia is suddenly looking for a lifeline and that Trump's threats of sanctions have forced Putin to come to the negotiating table. On the other end of the spectrum, from Russian media, you have this idea that Putin is going to this summit with basically all the chips in his hand and is looking to, if nothing else, create a strategic diplomatic wedge between the United States and the European Union and the rest of NATO by playing on Trump's ego. I've listened to a number of podcasts from Piotr, from Glenn Deason, from John Mearsheimer, and the good news is that I think we all have the same general conclusion, right? And that is right now, unless we are all collectively very, very wrong, Putin has the upper hand, and Trump is looking to capitalize on this for his own quest for some kind of Nobel Peace Prize or, whatever it is. Anyways, I put together just a little preview of what my thoughts are. No podcasts, no interviews. I'm not arguing with any liberalists or whatever, despite the fact that I respect pretty much most of the opinions of James Kerr-Lindsay, as well as Piotr. The three of us have certainly had a number of great conversations together, but this is just my own little hot take. And preemptive apologies if I'm just using a PowerPoint as opposed to a webcam. I think that, look, I've been in academia for about 20 plus years. I work better when I'm using PowerPoint. So, anyways, look, here is what we know thus far. Okay, we know that the meeting is going to be a one-day, to my knowledge, it will be a one-day event that will be held at the Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson Air Base in Anchorage, Alaska. And people were wondering, why Alaska? Why not Washington or Dubai or Vienna or Moscow? I think that the decision of Alaska plays into this idea, right, of shared territory, historically shared territory between that of Russia and the United States. What's also the case is that it's at a military base. The lineup of who will be there, I mean, we are talking about high-level delegations. I mean, from Russia, we have President Putin, we have Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, we have Defense Minister Andrei Belosov, Finance Minister Anton Silonov, and Presidential Foreign Policy Aide Yuri Ushakov, who was the attaché to working with the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. On the U.S. side, we have President Trump, no surprise, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent. So what does this mean? This means that this is something that is going to go beyond just talking about Ukraine, but also, in my opinion, focusing on more long-term resumption of U.S.-Russian economic cooperative ventures. So there's really going to be two primary topics discussed. The first one is talking about ending the war in Ukraine, which I don't think we're going to come to an agreement tomorrow. Unless Trump gives Putin everything that he is asking for, I think at the absolute best, this is going to be a discussion that begins further discussions. But in my opinion, I think that this meeting, especially if we consider the presence of finance ministers, secretaries of treasury, really reestablishing U.S.-Russian economic cooperative ventures, which may be the one thing that Trump actually has in his hand that can persuade Putin to be a little bit more reasonable. Ukraine, in my opinion, and I've said this from the start of the war, was never the issue. Ukraine was just simply the sacrificial lamb, right, upon which the future world order is going to be decided. And this is not me taking any particular sides. I just know that a country like Ukraine was always going to be thrown under the bus. And the fact that Trump is most likely ready to give Putin some territorial concessions already means, right, that Ukraine was never really the one country that everybody was defending. But I think, and we have to be very clear on this, I don't think that this is going to be anything other than a talk aimed to continue talking. And this is not because neither side is going to relent, but any negotiated agreement on the cessation of hostilities takes multiple rounds of talks. And if at the end of the day, both Trump and Putin end in a handshake and an agreement to continue the conversation, well, then we're still in the game. So don't expect any major breakthroughs. Dmitry Peskov has already said that there will be no documents signed. There's going to be no final agreements reached. But what we do know is that the willingness of Russia, and more specifically, the willingness of Putin, Lavrov, and Belousov. I mean, these are three of the highest ranking people within the Russian government to meet with Trump in Alaska already implies that Witkoff's meeting to Russia a couple of weeks ago was, as was reported, productive. So what was it that Witkoff was able to offer that got Russia to say, okay, this is something worth our time? I think it was last year, a couple of months ago. I'm sorry, I don't remember this, but there was some kind of planned meeting between the Russian and the Ukrainian side to talk about ending hostilities, and Europe, NATO, the West was all indignant because Putin didn't show up, Lavrov didn't show up. They sent some lower level bureaucrat thinking that Russia was not serious about this. Let's put it this way. I've studied Russian politics, Russian foreign policy for a long time. When you're able to get Putin and Lavrov in the same room to do something, then you know that you have already made a lot of headway beforehand. So they are not going to waste their time debating over things that, mid-level management can sort out. So there's probably going to be some kind of at least rhetorical agreement between Trump and Putin. So the fact that we have such high-level leaders in both Russia and the United States implies that there's going to be something reached, but whether something is officially signed, remains to be seen. All right, so what can we expect? This is my own little, hot take on all of this. All signs, all radio chatter, almost every single Telegram channel that I follow, including the pro-Ukrainian ones, are saying that Trump is going to offer Putin some kind of land for peace deal, right? Which most likely will include the Crimean Peninsula, which has been out of Ukraine's hands for more than a decade, and the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, right? The Donbas region. Trump has said, at least this is him, catering to his base, that if he doesn't get Putin to agree with what he wants, there's going to be, heavy sanctions against Russia. It's not going to be worth his time talking with Russia anymore. I think Trump has even gone on record at one point say that he's going to be the toughest guy that Putin will ever have to deal with. I sincerely doubt that. Knowing full well that Trump absolutely loves to be flattered. And I'm going to sort of go off script here for a moment. And, for those of you who have followed my translation videos, by the way, thank you for all of you who have. It takes me a while to get these things done. But you probably have noticed, especially when Putin is talking about Trump, he constantly mentions how Trump is this very smart guy, this strategic leader, this rational person, very different from the usual cadre that comes in Washington. I don't think for a moment that Putin really believes this. There's very few people in the world that I think Putin genuinely likes. But what he is doing is playing into Trump's ego, who loves eating up this idea that, people like Putin or Xi Jinping or others, if they regard Trump as, total, alpha Chad, he gets absolutely excited over this. So I'm pretty certain that with both Putin and Lavrov in the same room as Trump, Vance, Rubio, and others, there's going to be a lot of flattery. There's going to be a lot of compliments that are going to be given. And I could be wrong, and if I am wrong, I'm more than happy to admit this, but my guess is that right now the diplomatic advantage relies on Russia's side. But I think that Trump will agree to whatever Putin wants in Ukraine for what he sees as the bigger prize. And that is reaching some kind of détente with Russia for bigger, and as I've already said, more long-term goals of economic cooperation. Okay? We're talking about the Arctic, we're talking about Siberia, we're talking about the Bering Sea between Russia and Alaska. And so if there is, any kind of breakthrough tomorrow, it's going to be because either A, Trump will have completely acquiesced on Putin's demands in Ukraine to go for the bigger stuff, or he's going to make Putin an offer that either A, he can't refuse, or will have to refuse. But there's not going to be a compromise, right? This is at least where I'm thinking about, is that I will be very, very surprised if Putin makes a compromise on what his demands for the end of conflict in Ukraine are, which stands very clearly. 5 territories in Ukraine go to Russia. Ukraine openly and legally declares itself militarily neutral, and the political culture in Ukraine denazifies, whatever that means, right? So I am fully, convinced that both Putin and Lavrov are going to be in unison in presenting their positions on conditions for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And it is Trump's decision to either take it or leave it. I will be surprised if Trump provides a counteroffer in which Putin will have to roll back some of his demands. If that is the case, the two will, at the absolute least, agree to continue talking in the coming weeks and months. But I will be very, very surprised if Putin agrees to something other than what he has previously demanded. And what he wants, more than anything else, is a complete annexation, as I've already said, of these 5 regions: Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. Crimea has been out of Ukraine's hands for over 10 years. Lugansk is a region that is now completely controlled by Russia. Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson are largely, I would say, 50 to 75% within Russian control. Which means that if Trump gives Putin exactly what he wants tomorrow in exchange for peace, it is going to give Russia a significant amount of territory that it has not yet claimed, that it is not yet controlled. Now, what this can do is force Russia's hand into a ceasefire. I don't see how this is going to further Russia's ultimate aim in preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. I also don't see how this is going to end the conflict permanently, rather than just simply prolong it, but something that I want to bring up here. But as we've already said, Russia's terms for peace, whether you agree with it or not, this is just simply factual evidence, is from Putin the full recognition of Russia's annexation and control of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and the Kherson regions. The full and official Ukrainian declaration of neutrality, which means that no NATO membership, not now, not ever. This very loose idea of denazification of Ukraine and Ukrainian political culture, which, look, there has been ample evidence that has been published in the last, 5 years or even more, that hardline right-wing ethno-nationalist elements in Ukraine, certainly supported, unfortunately, either knowingly or unknowingly by the West, have a lot of ties, open, unapologetic ties to neo-Nazi movements. And that's not the only issue. The issue is that Ukrainian political culture has been working to effectively de-Russify the country. And that means prohibit the use of the language in public places, eliminate as many Russian-speaking radio stations, television stations, newspapers, among others, effectively cancel Russian literature, music, and culture, dismantling and destroying many Soviet-era and Russian imperial-era monuments. And here's the worst part about it, right? Alienating a large majority of the population that otherwise would probably have sided with Ukraine. But just because they speak Russian, they're now considered to be suspect. And this says nothing about trying to prohibit, to delegitimize the largest Orthodox church within Ukraine. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, right, whose only crime is reporting to Moscow instead of having its own autocephalous theology. Anyways, in addition to that, Russia is also calling for the full halt to further NATO expansion into former Soviet territories. This includes Moldova and Georgia, to be sure, and the possibility of even Armenia. For those of you who have been following me, you know that, James and I, we like to talk about the crises happening in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The current government in Yerevan under the Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is flirting with the West. There is absolutely no guarantee that Armenia will not think about joining NATO, which of course is just another thorn in Russia's side. And finally, the permanent guarantees of mutually beneficial security so as to prevent a resumption of conflict in the near future. Ultimately, what Russia has been saying, and again, you are free to take them at their word or just see this as propaganda, is that any agreement on Ukraine cannot simply be a 6-month period in which Ukraine regroups, reloads, and, kind of feeds itself, only to resume violence again. There needs to be an end to the protracted social conflict that has existed in Ukraine arguably since 2008, if not even earlier. This is something that I teach in my classes on conflict resolution. You have what we would call negative peace and positive peace. A negative peace, just very simply defined, is ending the immediate conflict, right? Stopping the killing, stopping the violence. But it simply just creates a frozen conflict. Are people fighting? No. Is there any exchange of territories through control? No. But is anything being done to rectify the situation so this doesn't happen again in the future? Also no. A positive peace is one in which the underlying issues that led to the outbreak of conflict is addressed. Now, you can take Russia at their word, or you can just simply see this as propaganda. But Russia's whole position is that if we are going to end the fighting in Ukraine, we need to make certain that we will never have to resume it again. And that means NATO, the West, Germany, France, whatever, the UK in specific, does not use this time to rearm and retrain Ukrainian forces. Russia remembers the 8-year period between the alleged cessation of conflict in Donbass in 2014 and the outbreak of violence in 2021. So in 2022, I'm sorry. So the 8-year period, according to Russia, was simply a time in which the West was trying to convince Russia that they had the interest of peace in mind, but were ultimately securing Ukraine's military capability to retake the land and kick out all of the population. In the same way Azerbaijan did to the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, or what the Croats did to the Serbs in Krajina in 1995. Okay? So how realistic can we really see the next round of talks going here? While most journalists, while most YouTube channels that I agree with, again, we're talking, Glenn Deason's channel, John Mearsheimer, among others, Russia doesn't currently control all the areas it claims. So for them to demand the annexation of territory that it does not yet control means that they are either going to have to really, and I mean really, cater to Trump's ego, or the U.S. side is going to be just that inept, or just simply that, willing to end the conflict by any means possible. So this is effectively granting Putin full control of claimed land, is giving full concessions. It's like, Russia will walk away from this absolutely the winner. I don't see that happening. But at the same time, to suggest that Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO is just simply a matter of time is also unrealistic, because NATO's position is fragmented among its members, right? Hungary and Slovakia are the two most outspoken countries saying that they will absolutely veto Ukraine's membership. The French, the Germans, they're sort of ambivalent depending upon, the government that you have. Obviously, Poland and the Baltics, simply want to extend NATO all the way to South Korea, but, they are a loud, hawkish, but still numerically, minority within NATO's ranks. The thing that I have to also point out is that I think that NATO has largely achieved its more realistic goal of expansion by taking in Finland and Sweden, right? We all thought that this was a major embarrassment to Russia because two erstwhile neutral countries decide that they're going to join NATO. Notice how quickly Finland joined. Sweden took a little bit longer because, some Swedish liberals think that it's, A-okay to, burn Korans in the name of freedom of speech or whatever it is, right? But okay, what we end up seeing is that NATO has now almost entirely unified the European continent, right? With the exception of Austria, Switzerland, Ireland, Serbia, Bosnia. But other than that, I think that NATO has achieved its most realistic expansion with the inclusion of Finland, and something that Russia never really complained that much about. But, to include and to think that eventual membership will also be given to Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine presupposes really two things. One, it presupposes that all NATO members are going to be on board with this, which they're not. And two, that Russia has been resoundingly defeated enough for NATO to not worry about this. Considering what Russia has already done in Georgia, what interests and areas they still have in Moldova, and of course what they're doing in Ukraine, anybody but the most naive person will understand that Russia is certainly going to resist. But look, if Trump agrees, if we come from this agreement in Alaska, where Trump basically gives Putin all or most of what he is asking for, okay, it's going to come because of two reasons. Number one, he really wants to win with Putin. This is his own ego. He really wants to then turn to his constituents and said, I promised that I would end the war. We would end the war. And look, there is a large segment of the American population that has been asking on both the right as well as the left, why is Ukraine so important? Yes, the country was invaded. Yes, we understand that this is a horrible thing for the ordinary people of Ukraine. But why is it that this is the country that we need to draw a line in the sand for? Right? As far as the right is concerned, this has nothing to do with America's interests. As far as the left, and I mean like the real left, not that liberal Elizabeth Warren left, why do we need to all of a sudden be so morally indignant over what's happening in Ukraine when the very leaders that are telling us to do this are turning blind eye and deaf ear to genocide in Gaza, right? So, at the end of the day, as much as it caters to national interests, what does Ukraine have to do for, the bottom line? What does it have to do for any of us? And Trump is playing into that. The second reason is that, he's thinking beyond Ukraine, which I'm going to be perfectly honest with you folks. Ukraine was always expendable. Ukraine was disposable. I was just getting acclimated into Tashkent in February 2022. I hadn't even been there for a month when the war started. And I can tell you this much. My gut feeling once this happened was that Ukraine is screwed. No matter what happens, Ukraine is screwed. Ukrainian leaders may think that the West cares about them. They don't. I'm sorry to say, they don't. Ukraine is, as it has always been, a proxy for national interests of other countries. For the United States, up until, Trump's reelection, it was keeping the whole NATO dream alive. For Europe, what can I say? Liberalists wed themselves to an ideology that they can't afford to really walk away from. They decided that their fate was going to be in Ukraine's victory, and that didn't work out. But as far as Trump is concerned, Trump's not a liberalist. He's not even, I would say, even a realist. I think Trump is just simply an egoist. Trump is, as I said, thinking beyond Ukraine for larger economic ventures. And you can say that this is absolutely horrible or absolutely strategic. At the end of the day, it's absolutely what is, unfortunately, in this world today. But I have to also say that going into this meeting, given everything that's been happening up until recently, Russia seems to have the higher leverage. Russia right now can absolutely afford to scuttle this meeting tomorrow for a number of reasons. First of all, the Russian military is advancing at a rapid pace, right? The city of Pokrovsk, which if you've been following, and another shout out to another YouTube channel of mine that I've worked with, Weeb Union, they do a phenomenal job on day-to-day coverage of the war. Pokrovsk is billed as the last major fortified town in the Ukrainian east. If Pokrovsk falls, effectively the Ukrainian defense line breaks. And this is effectively what many people are seeing, is that the armed forces of Ukraine, the AFU, are destined to collapse in a few months. And this is especially true if the United States cuts all funding to Ukraine. Ukraine cannot afford to survive simply on EU money alone. It's just not going to work. So right now, Russia is enjoying military leverage. The second is that what is the biggest threat that Russia might face if the meeting with Trump doesn't work? Sanctions? Russia's been under multiple sanctions for years. I've said in multiple videos, podcasts and whatever, and I forget when this was. I have to go back and find this out. But in the early months of the war in Ukraine, Lavrov was giving a press conference, and somebody in the press had asked him, what is Russia going to do with all these sanctions that are put against it? And Lavrov's response was, we're Russia. At some point in our entire history, we have been sanctioned by somebody. So we're kind of used to it. The minute that we're not sanctioned, we don't know what we're going to do with all of this money. So the thing is that the threat of sanctions at least up until now, has only strengthened Russia's economy and its leverage with the rest of the world. And, if you've been also paying attention, you know that Trump has been threatening all kinds of tariffs, 25%, 30%, 50% tariffs on India, on Brazil, on China. And what has this done? Well, it's actually pushed these BRICS members into closer ties. Small countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan can be persuaded. The EU, which is run by the most incompetent and inept group of bureaucratic mediocrities, can certainly, fawn themselves in front of Trump. You all saw what Ursula von der Leyen had agreed to, what Mark Rutte had said. I mean, for all of Europe who likes to talk about how we're not Trump, we're better than Trump, every time Trump shows up to the show, they basically compete with each other over who can be the biggest ass kisser. So Trump works great with weaker countries. Bigger countries are able to resist, and they are able to effectively consolidate their support amongst one another. So the threat of sanctions against Russia, unless there is something that I just do not see, I don't see how additional sanctions from the United States are going to cripple this country. Because in the meantime, Russia is outpacing the West in terms of ammunition production. Russia has transitioned to a full-time wartime economy, and the economy is growing. So despite the, personnel losses on the battlefield, Russia is not economically isolated as many in the West would want you to believe. And all of these stories about how Russia is just, days away from economic collapse, that, soldiers are in Ukraine are stealing washing machines to use for spare parts or all that kind of nonsense. I mean, that proved to be lies. I mean, that proved to be just irresponsible lies from the West. Russia has adapted. And one of the big things in war studies, in international relations, is that countries that are, prepared for this, the longer you fight, the better you adapt. You learn from the realities of what warfare does. And in the meantime, Europe is more divided. And I have to say, and I have a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues and a lot of subscribers from Europe. So I say this very reluctantly, but Europe is becoming more irrelevant than ever. I mean, when you think about the leadership in Europe today, who really speaks on behalf of the continent? Macron? That's probably the best one. Starmer? I don't know anybody that takes Starmer seriously. And I know even less people that think of Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, as anything other than a comic character. I have lots of friends in Germany who are all telling me that Merz achieved only one thing, one undeniable thing. He ended up becoming an even bigger dolt of a chancellor than Scholz, before him. So look, what can we realistically expect from the meeting tomorrow? I think the first thing is that Ukraine's fate has been predictably abrogated by the United States. The Trump administration is coming to the table with at least an initial offer of some of the territory that Russia controls. Most likely, the realization that Crimea is gone, and Donetsk and Lugansk should also go to Russia as well. This will probably be the initial offer that Trump gives to Putin. We'll see what happens, but Putin would be remiss to take this for the simple reason that Russia needs a land bridge to Crimea. Giving Russia Donetsk and Lugansk without Zaporozhye and Kherson still makes Crimea an extraterritorial enclave. There might be some compromise in terms of Russia gets to keep what they currently control, whatever. I think, again, I could be wrong, and like every other YouTube channel out there that's making these big bombastic predictions, I'm at least being honest by saying, look, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. The only thing that we know is what we can assume. But Russia's most likely probable rejection of Trump's first offer of territorial concessions is going to happen if it doesn't include all five. So unless Trump is willing to give Putin all five, they'll walk away. They'll say, nope, that's not what we want. At the absolute best, there might be a willingness to continue discussions and dialogue, simply to not scuttle the opportunity of prying the U.S. away from the EU and Ukraine. One thing to look for tomorrow, and we'll only realize this in the days and weeks following, is not what is openly said, but what is analyzed by Putin, by Lavrov, and to a lesser extent by Belousov. If Russia realizes that they have somebody with with Trump, with whom they can continue to drive a wedge between the US and Europe, they won't walk away from this deal. They won't completely reject. They'll stall. They'll agree to a few things, but they will also agree to continue talking. And I say this both professionally as well as personally. If we break this down into really 5 main people, we have Putin, Lavrov, and Belousov on one side, and we have Trump and Rubio on the other. America is walking into this like amateurs. They're walking into this debate like absolute amateurs. Trump thinks that he can best Putin. I got news for you. And I say this not as a Putin supporter, but as somebody who has just noticed how Putin leads for 25 years. Trump can easily be bought out by flattery. Rubio's a newbie. Rubio is a amateur when it comes to Lavrov. Again, if I'm wrong, I have absolutely no problem recanting, but this is just what I'm going with. So I think that if the best thing that we can expect is a compromise that recognizes the realities of controlled territory without legal recognition or sovereignty. In other words, we don't reach a conflict resolution, but we try to come to a conflict management. The areas that Russia controls, Russia might be forced into a ceasefire, a halt, a further advancement, okay? Or at the absolute least, Russia's declaration, its admission that it will not seek any further territorial ambitions outside of these 5 regions, which means no Kharkov, no Odessa, no Kiev. If we get that, then we might have a breakthrough. But that would come if and only if Russia is given really 2 things. A, assurances that we have reached a full cessation of hostilities, and 2, an economic agreement with the United States that's just, too good you can't refuse. So will there be peace? I mean, here's my whole thing. Right now, Russia may not want it because it enjoys the tactical advantage on the battlefield. It is advancing. And at this stage of the game, the more that the agreements are stalled, the more Russia gains on that battlefield. If Pokrovsk falls, if the last major strategic footholds of the Ukrainian defensive forces break, all of a sudden Russia's got a green light all the way to the Dnieper River. They might go for Kharkov. They may decide to end it completely by taking Odessa. They haven't made any signs on Odessa yet, but I'll tell you this much. If Russia takes Odessa, it's game over. It's absolute game over because Russia now controls Ukraine's economy. So in the absence of a peace deal with Trump, there may be an agreement to pursue larger economic cooperative ends that may keep Washington happy and interested. Remember, the best way to understand Trump is really 2 things. His ego needs to be feeded, and 2, he wants to make money. If not for the United States, for himself. And as long as Russia is able to placate those 2 things, I think they can get whatever they want in Ukraine. Worst case scenario is that there's a breakdown in agreements, but Trump just simply throws his hands up and says, well, I'm going to focus on other things. In which case, Ukraine is left to Europe to solve. In which case, it won't be solved. Okay, like I hate to break it to you, whenever the United States says that a piece of something, a territory, needs to be handled by Europe, Europe does not stand up to the task here. So Putin has clarified his intents in the war and has delineated parts of Ukraine that he won't claim, at least up until now. The other thing is this: Russia has not yet achieved its tactical objectives. So a ceasefire might simply be an opportunity for Ukraine to rest, regroup, reload, resume. This is one of the big things that's permeating through the Telegram channels, right? And that is Putin should not sign any agreement with Trump if this is only going to give Ukraine the necessary breathing space to survive, right? If we're going to agree on something, the war is going to be over. All right, so some final hypothetical thoughts here. If Trump and Putin agreed to meet, as I've already said, then there's already some deal that's been agreed on. Putin does not waste his time wheeling and dealing. He will only show up to things when stuff has already been agreed on. He will show up for the press conference, for the big summit, for the photo ops, and if there is anything for him to put his signature to, he will. Neither him nor Trump are people that waste their time on just simply talking for the sake of talking. So what that means is that if Russia has already agreed to meet with the United States, I am 90 to 95% certain that the United States is already willing to give Russia a chunk of what it is demanding. Okay? And what this also means is that the United States, under Trump, is, as I've said for years, ready to write off Ukraine to focus on bigger things, right? Ukraine, according to Trump, that's Biden's war. That's something that he didn't start. And for him to basically turn around to the American public and say, I ended the war that Biden started, is all that he wants. So this is also an advantage in Russia's side, because Ukraine's future is more important to Russia than anything that it could ever possibly be to the United States. Okay? I also think that there is going to be a focus on what Russia insists on keeping within its own sphere of interest. So Iran, which is a BRICS member, right? Russia might tell Putin, we'll deal with Iran. We'll, make certain it doesn't create a bigger security dilemma. In the meantime, we'll kind of look the other way in terms of Israel. Israel's your thing. Iran is our thing. Again, all of these are hypothetics. And the final thing, and this is something that I will most likely talk about in an upcoming video. In fact, next week, next Tuesday, I'm scheduled to once again meet with Pascal from Neutrality Studies, another good friend and colleague of mine. We are going to have a full-on discussion about the Trump-Putin summit, the assessments of the agreements reached between Armenia and Azerbaijan, what this means for the geopolitical world, and the idea that I've been saying that the fate of Ukraine is going to shape the fate of the geopolitical world that was started in 2008 with Kosovo. And if you've been following me, you know that I, never miss an opportunity to bring up the Kosovo precedent because, yes, it is a precedent. All of the major Western leaders that are, absolutely defending Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereign authority are the very same countries that have embassies and not consulates in Pristina. So the whole notion of territorial integrity has already been broken. And no matter how much many in the West want to say that Kosovo is not a precedent, it's a precedent. Okay? It's a precedent. I'm not saying that all of a sudden we need to force Kosovo back into Serbia if we want to keep Ukraine's 1991 borders, but the whole idea of borders that many people say are untouchable are very much touchable and have been touched by the very countries and leaders that say borders are not to be touched. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's my little rundown of what we can expect for tomorrow. I don't know how long this has been. I've just been kind of speaking, it's kind of like the way that I do my video lectures, but let's see what happens. In a couple of days, as I said, I'm going to meet with Pascal. We will jointly host a talk on both his channel and mine, and you can expect at least within a week or two for me to have my regular roundup discussions with James and Pyotr. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you all soon.